You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley. And today we have Cassandra with us. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Just living the dream. That's what they tell me. Lately we've had a few guests, but now we're going to go through a stretch where we're going to have to force you to be on here unless I got to go solo.
Well, here we are.
Yes. So today's topic is something that gets brought up all the time, and it is, do you trust traditional mold testing? So when you hear me say traditional mold testing, like, what do you think that is?
Air testing is what comes to mind first.
Yeah. So when I talk to pretty much what I mean by traditional testing is the stuff, that we do quickly as mold inspectors. So it's non-viable testing, meaning we don't take an agar plate or petri dish and open it for an hour in a room, then close it, and then wait for days for it to become viable and start reproducing, colonizing. What we do with a traditional test is either an air test, tape lift, swab, or we can do a bulk sample, which bulk sampling's a little bit different. But anyhow, it's just a non-viable, quick test that we have a lab that just looks at it under a microscope. So they're not looking at like viable mold that's all nice and fuzzy. Does that make sense? It does make sense.
I think, what's the ballpark cost for traditional mold testing? Because I know if I'm a layperson, I'm listening to this. Like, what am I spending hundreds? Because I've noticed that sometimes for even medical testing, let alone mold testing, some people will spend a ridiculous amount of money to do testing. So what is normal with traditional mold testing?
A lot of it depends on your local mold company. We charge, and I don't know for sure what our website says, but I think it's $80 for an air test and a surface sample, I think $60. That includes our mold fees, our supplies, the lab fees, our supplies, and shipping. So a lot of it depends, I guess, on where you're at and who the inspector is, but you're not going to get it, in my opinion, you're not going to get it any cheaper than like $50 per sample.
But ballpark, I mean, if somebody's listening and they just got quoted by somebody to do traditional mold testing, we're not getting into the non-traditional or the extensive, but if they're getting quoted like $3,000.
Oh, that's outrageous.
Okay. Because I think it's important to help people understand what's the ballpark of what they should expect to pay for, and we're being very specific, traditional mold testing.
Oh, I could do EMA, endotoxin. I could do a bunch of stuff for $3,000. I wouldn't even feel comfortable charging my clients that much money. So just to be clear too with our listeners, for the most part, and I say for the most part, I'm only talking about CNC contractor services. We do not just go in and do testing. Now, if we go in to do a PRV thing. It's not a full mold inspection.
And PRV is what?
Post-remediation verification.
Okay. So right after a mold job has been completed, PRV testing is what happens.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so it's not a full inspection. It's pretty much we're inspecting the areas that were remediated, doing some tape lifts, maybe running a few air samples. Something like that should only cost, a couple $100. Most of our stuff, though, and this is why I want to explain it, is we charge, and I think it's $500 for a full mold inspection, and then we charge for testing after that.
Okay.
So let's go through a scenario. Let's say I go do an inspection on one of our listeners' homes. For the most part, it's not too bad. We don't find any visible mold growth. If we find visible mold growth, for the most part, I just tell my clients, hey, we need to jump to the remediation phase. So let's not even test. Some of my clients, depending on the situation, will say, well, we want to test to see what kind of mold it is. My response is, okay, we'll do whatever they want. For something like that, you would do a tape lift or a swab and send that off to a lab. But going back to our scenario, let's say for the most part, we don't find any visible mold. We don't really have any concerns. We're going to run some air tests. If it's a home that has a basement and then one level above it, we're going to run one outside, one in the basement, one on the main level. Mm-hmm. So minimum of 3 tests. So you're looking at, $200 to $300 in testing for those 3 air tests plus the $500 mold inspection.
So ballpark $1,000 in that case scenario. But I guess the reason why I think it's so important to understand, because oftentimes people will think, even in the functional medicine world, the more money I spend on supplements, so they'll spend thousands of dollars on supplements, the better I'll feel. Sometimes people think about mold testing. The more money I spend on mold testing, the more precise everything should be. And then you wind up with clients that spend thousands upon thousands on mold testing. I
know that my fellow inspectors out there, and some do listen to the podcast, I know they're not going to agree with this, but I don't believe it's necessary, nor do I believe you should spend that kind of money pre-remediation. Okay. Now, if you don't need remediation and you're spending all this money on testing, my question would be why? Like, is their teenage daughter, has she just been diagnosed with, something wrong with her thyroid or Hashimoto's? Or, does one of the occupants of the home have CIRS, which is CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is more or less the Schumacher, you're mold sensitive. So if they said that to me, I would say, okay, that makes sense. You have people in the home that are very sensitive to mold, have other autoimmune disorders. Let's not spend all that money, and maybe let's do a deep clean of your home. And then after that, let's go to the testing phase. Because in my opinion, why would you spend all of this money and then ask me, like, well, what should we do? And I say, oh, you should do a deep clean. So then you go spend the money on the deep clean. Mm-hmm. And depending on, the size of your home and what it is and who you're paying, could be a couple $1,000s. Why wouldn't you do all of that test post a deep clean?
Exactly. You want to actually do something first and then do all the testing to see what's left to handle.
Yeah, let's do some sort of mitigation first.
Yeah.
And then we can jump into all of that. Because let's say we spend $3,000 on all this testing. I mean, endotoxin, bacteria, mycotoxin, EMA. I mean, you could go through a whole list. And then we get all the results. And then I say to them, well, you should do a deep clean. Not that they would spend the $3,000 again post deep cleaning. But on the other hand, you'd have to spend enough money to see if it was worth it.
Absolutely.
So to me, save all your money until you've done some sort of procedure.
Well, and it brings us full circle to the topic for today's episode. Do you trust your traditional mold test, right? So people do testing because they want to have an accurate measure of what's going on with their indoor air quality. Why isn't traditional testing how you're describing it? Why isn't it accurate?
Well, for the most part, so our listeners, and I'm just going to throw a few different scenarios out there. The cheapest route, so you're going to go by, let's just say it's immunolytics. They're agar plates, Petri dishes. I'm not sure if it's agar, but it could be like potato dextrose, but it's a Petri dish. You could just go do that all on your own. Okay, so you go do that all on your own. They give you the results. Well, how do you even know what those results mean? Mm-hmm. Let's say another scenario is you have a local mold inspector who's, doubles as a home inspector. And so they're not really a mold specialist. They're just a home inspector that got certified in mold. They come in, they're just going to run traditional testing. So they pull out their air pump and they do some air tests. How accurate do you think that those results would be, first and foremost, if the person's not qualified? And then on top of that, all it is an air test. To me, that wouldn't be very accurate at all. So my point is homes, and we've talked about it and we'll talk about it in the future, homes are somewhat pressurized. And they say on average, those pressures, which is neutral, positive, negative. Mm-hmm. Neutral means there's really no airflow. Positive, if you imagine being in a bubble, mm-hmm. that would be positive pressure. So once you're inside that bubble, let's say it's a lab or, inside of a suit you wear in a lab, mm-hmm. that's positive. So nothing from the outside can come in. And then you have negative. Negative would mean you're pulling in air from the outside. On average, those air pressures change 7 to 10 times per hour. Wow. So they're changing all the time. So let's say you do an air test and in that minute, that moment of that day, there's neutral air pressure, or let's say it's positive. How do we know what mold you're getting if they're in a wall cavity, in a crawl space, in an attic? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like doing what's the diabetes test?
A1C.
Don't they say you should be fasting?
Not necessarily. Well, you should take a fasting blood glucose to see what really your body's doing without the impact of what you just ate 30 minutes ago.
Okay. Well, I know we've talked about other tests, and you've told me that, depending on when you take them, they're not that accurate.
Correct. Yep.
It's the same principle with traditional testing. Like, different mold spores have different characteristics. So, like a Stachybotrys is a heavier, stickier mold. Well, it's not always going to get picked up in an air test. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, my point is you're not really getting an accurate assessment. And that's why if we're doing only traditional testing, I always recommend you do a few tape lifts.
Okay.
So that you'll pick up those molds that are not airborne at the time of the testing, along with the air testing.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So really, its accuracy is impacted by the indoor air quality in the moment at the time.
Exactly.
So that's one variable that nobody can control. Then also the different traditional forms of testing, like the tape lift, the swab, the air testable, they all could pick up some molds and not others, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and then on top of all of that, the problem with traditional testing, we're only, and when I say we, it's the lab, they're only identifying the mold type at the genus level, meaning if you have the family, let's just say you have a family of snakes in the reptile family. So the mold's the reptile family, then you have snakes, then you have lizards, then you have whatever else. There's a bunch of different types of snakes too. We're only identifying that it's a snake.
Okay.
So with mold, we're only identifying that it's Cladosporium or it's Aspergillus. We're not even getting down to the species level.
So we're not even saying whether that's a garden snake,
a garter
or snake, or a rattlesnake.
Cobra, exactly.
Yeah, so that's a big...
Yeah.
A garter to a cobra, that's
exactly.
a big deal.
So it matters.
Yeah, it matters, yeah.
But that's why it's the cheapest type of testing.
Okay.
And, I think naturally as humans, most people don't have the money, nor would they want to spend $3,000 in testing. So it's the cheapest testing, but you're going to get the cheapest results.
You're going to get what you pay for.
Exactly.
So then what types of testing should clients trust?
Well, that's where we get into the ERMI and the EMA testing.
Okay.
And our listeners know how I feel about ERMI. The ERMI does identify the mold species, and it's a dust sampling. Same with the EMA. But the EMA does mold species and mycotoxins.
Oh, okay.
That's why I'm not a fan of ERMI.
Well, and you did 2 episodes of this podcast about ERMI, didn't you?
Yeah.
Way back when.
Way
back. But if you look, you'll find it.
Yeah. And I didn't have as much knowledge.
We should probably do a follow-up to that now that I'm thinking about it.
Well, we did an EMA versus ERMI just a couple months ago. Okay. Well, after we did the mycotoxins.
But maybe we should do a follow-up to the ERMI.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm not totally against it, but on the other hand, the ERMI's telling us that, okay, they're going to give us the species, but it's still not telling us if that mold species produced and released mycotoxins.
Correct.
Whereas the EMA is going to tell us, because there's two different sets of results, the mold species and mycotoxins. Does that make sense? Whereas ERMI only tells you the species.
So you're saying that in addition to traditional testing, people should also be doing like EMA and ERMI?
Yes.
Okay.
And, you know, for our listeners, if they think they're sick and there's mycotoxins in the home, an EMA test, now once again, I want to be clear, all testing should be accompanied with an inspection.
Yes.
But let's just say they choose not to. And they've heard about this ERMI test or the Hurts Me Too out there. In my opinion, they're better off spending the money and buying the EMA test, and they can do it themselves. That way we can see, are there mycotoxins in the home?
Correct. And I think what you're also saying is, you know, no one test, whether it's ERMI, EMA, or traditional, is the holy grail of testing.
Exactly. There's no silver bullet test.
Okay.
And that's one of the, it's no different than if you compare the medical testing. There is not, well, not that I know of, there's not a silver bullet test, let's just say some sort of blood test, that's going to answer everything.
Yeah.
Mold testing's the same way.
Absolutely. So then what's your call to action for people?
Well, when it comes to testing, don't just take, let's just say you do only air testing and you think you're sick because of mold and mycotoxins. Do not just trust that test. Get a second opinion, whether it's another inspector or IEP, which is indoor environmental professional, or do another type of test. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
A lot of times what I hear from my clients is they say, yeah, we had a mold inspector. They did testing and they said everything's fine. Well, that tells me one of two things. First and foremost, I cannot look at test results and an inspection and say everything's fine, because you have to tell the client, maybe you need to go do medical mycotoxin testing. It tells me that. And then on the other hand, it tells me that the IEP is not that experienced when it comes to the medical side of mold exposure.
Okay.
So getting a second opinion is always recommended.
And the more comprehensive testing like EMA, which you offer consultations with EMA, becomes really important in the mix of all this too.
Exactly. And on our website, for our listeners, you can buy, and right now I believe it's $400, you can buy an EMA test from us. So they go to our website, they click on that link, it takes them to the PayPal, they pay. Once we get notified, we actually send them a receipt. They'll get an email from us, and then we have the kit shipped to them from the lab. They can do the test on their own. Mm-hmm. They do the dust sampling. There's instructions with it. They send it off to the lab. It does take, it says 10 days, I believe, but I typically have results within the next week once the lab has it. But anyhow, buying it for the $400 that you buy it from our site, it's $399 from Real Time Labs. Mm-hmm. So if you go buy it on your own from Real Time Labs, you don't get my analysis of the results.
Yep.
So like you said, there are packages where they could do that are obviously more expensive. They can buy the EMA testing with a consultation, and they can buy the EMA test with a consultation and a VPA. So there's options. And my point is, for our listeners, if you just go to the website to Real Time Lab and buy that kit, you're going to have to pay me for a consultation to review those results and tell you what my interpretations are.
Whereas if you just go to cnccontractorservices.com and look up the mycotoxin testing, you can get all of that in a great package right then and there.
Yep. So my point is, just buy it from us.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's the same price you're going to get it at the lab. Mm-hmm. So pretty simple, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, you've listened to the episode that we focused on, and it was called, Do You Trust Your Traditional Mold Test? So we appreciate all of you for listening, and have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.